Welcome back to the Miller Center for a discussion of President Trump's America First doctrine revisited. In the first term, according to the framing, "Let Trump be Trump," President Trump had a revolutionary approach to foreign policy, but he was foiled time and again by traditionalists, or even worse, the deep state. His first term team was a team of rivals, often rivals against one another, always rivals against him. This time it's different. He's got his own team in place. They're taking the lead, pursuing his goals. One of the watchwords for what's different is that Trump is a hyper-realist. To quote the Thucydides, because there's always a Greek in the room, "The strong do what they will, the weak do what they must." In this vision, Trump defines U.S. national interests very narrowly in zero-sum terms. A win for me is a loss for you, and vice versa. He's suspicious of multilateral organizations and of an alliance, particularly alliances with democracies. More broadly, he has an apparent affinity for strongmen leaders and wants to see a return to great power politics, with the US, Russia, and China carving up spheres of influence. As we've discussed before, that approach in doctrine may be a tactic toward a particular agreement, or it may be an end in itself, but it sure feels different. But how different has it actually been? The rhetoric of the incoming administration was often radical. There have been a number of high-profile initiatives to show how unique Trump is. Greenland, Panama. Still, it appears in a number of regards, this team may be reverting to the mean. To talk about this, we've put together a terrific segment of the Miller Center's wide group of national security scholars and practitioners. As many of you know, today's panelists are regular contributors to the Miller Center's War Room initiative, which was launched at the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine now 3.5 years ago. This faculty group meets regularly every other week now, going into halfway through their 4th year, bringing together experts to assess the conflict and geopolitics in the broadest regard. Today we'll explore the evolution of Trump administration America First initiative and how it's shaping our current foreign policy agenda. Quick introductions, and then we'll get right at it. First, in alphabetical order, Jeff LeGros. Jeff is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Miller Center, as well as professor and former provost at the University of Richmond. He's an expert on foreign affairs, American security, and national security strategy, and his handicap is 1 stroke below mine. Steve Mall is former ambassador to Poland and Lithuania and a State Department undersecretary. He also serves as a Miller Center practitioner fellow. He's the only person at the table who served in a Trump administration, where he was undersecretary for politics, or for policy at the State Department, the number 3 position. And he currently serves as vice provost for international affairs here. John Owen is a Miller Center, where are you, John? John Owen, a Miller Center faculty senior fellow, professor in UVA's Department of Politics, an expert on war, regime change, religion, democracy, and international order. Phil Potter is the founding director of the National Security Policy Center here at the university, as well as a new National Security Institute at the university. He's a professor at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, and he offers insights on all matters related to war, defense, national security, including nuclear policy. Maybe we'll get into that as well. And finally, last but not least, is Mara Rudman, professor of practice here at the center, former Schlesinger professor, which is our distinguished professor for senior national security officials. She directs the Ripples of Hope project. She's served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, including as deputy assistant to the president for national security affairs and as former deputy envoy and chief of staff for the special envoy on Middle East peace. As always, we'll take questions from the audience. Today's session is 75 minutes. So we'll go for about an hour and then have about 15 minutes for questions. Please, in the room, write your questions on cards. And those watching online, please submit them using the Q&A function. As I said to the group as we were preparing, typically when we get together, we're often talking about immediate current events I dare say we're day trading on politics, but we're not really, because the group brings incredible depth and breadth of focus. But for this session, we really wanted to draw the lens back and see what's changed and what's different. And yet, in the last 24 hours, we've seen conflicts testing U.S. alliance policy in two different regions of the world. So we'll start with the topic that has been on our mind for 3.5 years, which is Russia and the war in Ukraine, where just in the last 24 hours, we've seen yet another incident testing the U.S., particularly its relationship with longstanding allies. President Trump promised in his third election campaign, his second successful one, promised to end the war in Ukraine on day one. His first month started with an Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky that might be described as rocky. It ended with some shuttle summit diplomacy that appeared to put Europe actually in the driver's seat. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a NATO summit that increased European spending on defense, but seemed to tie the United States in deeper. So we're really in a radically different place than we were at the end of the Biden administration, or have things fundamentally changed? Let's start with Steve.
Well, I think things...
As a former ambassador to Poland.
I think things have fundamentally changed. I mean, certainly the themes that characterized Trump 1 are still there, even more so in Trump 2. I think, though, he has been much more successful at redrawing the bounds of executive power. His dismantlement of USAID, the foreign assistance structure, his efforts to dismantle Voice of America, American Public Media, broadcasting, his use of impoundment to stop the expenditure of funds, his significant cutbacks, certainly in the State Department, has resulted in basically crippling, for rightly or wrongly, the ability of any subsequent administration to quickly restore it. So I think that is a very important change from Trump 1. In terms of the situation in Ukraine, it seems like ever since the beginning of the Trump administration, Trump 2, Putin has been gradually asserting more and more pressure on the United States and American interests without any predictable pushback from us. And last night's episode of 19 drones being launched from Belarus to cross Polish territory, Polish airspace, a NATO ally, is very alarming. This comes at the end of several years' worth of increasing gray zone activities, arson attacks in Poland and elsewhere, slicing through of undersea cables that connect NATO and the Baltic Sea, all of them sooner or later linked to Russian efforts, Russian organized crime links. And so without any significant pushback, I fear that Putin is going to become even more aggressive, as he has since his summit with President Trump in Alaska a couple of weeks ago.
Can I say it's not just without significant pushback, it's literally having rolled out the red carpet for him in Alaska, and then he essentially had the same treatment in China. So if he's trying to figure out where he is and what his boundaries are, he thinks he's got a world that is exactly where he wants it to be. And so in that sense, to me, it's logical that he would have been further testing the boundaries right now with Poland.
Oh, another thing on testing, I really like your introductory framing, Bill. I'm going to do a very short but slightly alternative framing that doesn't contradict what you said. And I think a good way to understand President Trump is he's trying to concentrate power in the White House, both domestically and internationally. And so there are many, many constraints out there that we could explain. We could say they're actually in America's interest to have certain constraints, but that's not how Donald Trump sees power. And so internationally, this means, among other things, weakening international institutions and restraints, distancing yourself from allies, which means moving a bit toward adversaries, what we have thought of as adversaries, so that you can cut deals, so that you're an honest, supposedly honest broker.
It says you're a broker.
Broker, right. Yeah, and so this is the theory, I think, and I'm ascribing more coherence, I think, than is in the real world, but go with me for a minute. For this to work, you really do have to maintain your reputation and ability as a superpower. Everyone has to respect you and be a little afraid of you. And I think this is so Vladimir Putin, I don't think he's afraid, or he's not sure he needs to be afraid anymore, and he's testing. I think that's what's going on here. Using Belarus as a proxy, attacking Poland. We use that word every day now, unprecedented, yet another unprecedented event. And so I think that's what's going on. And so the entire, insofar as the president has a strategy, at least an instinctive one, it seems to be unraveling, or it could unravel very quickly, depending on what happens in the next few days, I think.
Yeah, I would just say to further amplify that point and the fact that to be able to execute whatever you want to execute as president with an all-powerful executive branch or presidency, which I agree is his intent. I think the courts will still be weighing in, and the Supreme Court itself, in terms of just how far that can go. But how he confronts the fact that he is not projecting the power in the world that he thinks he is. And there's a very interesting Wall Street Journal editorial. I'm not generally, it is unusual for me to find myself in agreement with Wall Street Journal editorials, and particularly to have cited work that I did. So a couple days ago, the Wall Street Journal, favorably, I should say.
Well done.
The Wall Street Journal editorial used as an entry point the Department of War versus Department of Defense. Name change, but said basically it doesn't matter what you call it. The issue is the United States' ability to project in the world. And then they quoted the National Defense Strategy Commission, which was 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and what we said last fall, which is basically we're not where we need to be at all, and these are the things we need to do. And they're basically saying Trump administration hasn't done any of that, is not taking that seriously, is exactly in the position that you're describing.
This goes for trade as well, but I think you can apply this across the board, but yeah.
So I think that there's something in addition going on here in terms of sort of time horizons and priorities. And we're going to get to a conversation, I think, of what the priorities for the Trump administration really are, what the doctrine is, everything along those lines. My take is that whatever it is, it's not Russia, right? And that we're getting to a place where, and this happens in a very common way in populist stories, but where that affinity for strongmen that you described before is a little more nuanced than maybe we had previously understood, in the sense that they were appealing before because they were a thorn in the side of DC foreign policy elites, right? Now they're a thorn in his side, right? Because it turns out if you have absolute control, you have the same sorts of vulnerabilities. And so I think we're looking at a very interesting dynamic here where Russia is having to behave a little bit like North Korea and say, hey, as soon as you start ignoring me and forgetting me, I'm going to have to do something that's highly provocative, right, in order to stay in the conversation. Because we're in this contest for time horizon. Russia's hurting right now, right? The fuel supplies are a real issue. This is not the kind of thing, I think Putin believes himself to have staying power, but it's not infinite. And I think he believes he has a window to sort of punch the Ukrainians out right now. But if he gets, if that gets rolled out and the Ukrainians have that staying power and Europe kind of fills the void and the US sort of says, hey, we don't really care about this, we'd rather think about China or whatever else it might be, that window closes. And so I think we're at a very interesting moment right now as those forces sort of play with one another in the international arena.
Yeah, so I guess I come at this a little bit more top-down first to get at the Russia question, and it speaks to this question of the Trump doctrine. And I kind of see less of a doctrine taking shape, although historically our doctrines are much clearer in retrospect than they are at the time. So we'll know more going forward. But you know, if there is such a thing, it's kind of spheres of influence with a la carte globalism. So, you know, I think he does see this worldview of a Russia, China, U.S., with Russia a fairly small sphere, China not as big a sphere as it wants, and the U.S. sphere being broader than that, but especially with this homeland, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But I think that's still less of a doctrine than actually what you're going to see in foreign policy, which is a set of his kind of personal intuitions, preferences, hunches, and impulses. And I think these are, when you talk about is it different than the past, some of these intuitions I think would be shared by an array of presidents in different forms. But the form, because what we're dealing with is a transition in our international order from an order that existed for a long time, the liberal international order, to something new. And any president would have to deal with that. But his intuitions are mercantilist, right? Everything is a deal where the U.S. must gain advantage. He's not concerned with growing the pie. He's concerned with getting a bigger slice for the U.S. of the pie. It seems very smart right in the moment. It's, in my mind, not very smart over the longer term. And so it's deal-driven. Second, ideological. Now, we think that the Trump administration has said goodbye to multilateralism, to democracy promotion, but in fact, there's a strong ideological promotion thesis that's part of his hunches, right? Which is social conservative and which is strong leader, often authoritarian, right? And he is, of course, this is part of the broader program of trying to tell people that the best way for the U.S., the only way for the U.S. to adapt to modern circumstances and rapid change is top-down, driven by the president themselves, and therefore you need the powerful president. And the third, I would say, it's politically driven. There's no divide between domestic and international policy, and international policy is driven by domestic priorities. You might say every president has done that, and every president has done that to a degree, but I would say the degree to which the international and national interest is judged on its own has been significantly greater for most past presidents. We can debate that. And the final thing I would say is there's this funny mix of power-based policy, not unusual for the United States, but really trying to emphasize the U.S. still has power in the world, which many academics have been arguing for a while, and that it should use it more. But power-based with conflict avoidance. Now, you might say it's not conflict avoidant, because what about all these uses of force? But in fact, most of those have been low risk, avoid the central conflict. And I think that's part of his reasoning about the spheres of influence. Finally, coming to Russia, I do think the Russia embrace of Putin is, in fact, I've struggled with this, but is in fact an effort at a wedge strategy. That he fears Russia and China together, thinks that's the big strategic problem, and that he's trying to drive that wedge, and I think his strategy is not going to do that. And in odd ways, the effort is actually leading to something that's in the U.S. interest, which is stronger alliance relationships. I'm baffled by the sending drones into Poland. All you're doing is solidifying the West, not splitting it.
How is India going to China with Putin, leading to stronger alliances? India is pretty important for the United States strategically.
I agree.
And he's
No, that's the one piece. But the Ukraine, but that's his judgment on that, right? I mean, he could have done something different. All I'm saying is that the failure of the peace initiative to Putin is driving the West and the U.S. closer together. In my mind, that is actually the pivotal strength of the U.S. strategy in the long run.
But there are two pieces here, right? One is India is going to China for the three-way handshake with Putin and Xi because Trump is ratcheting up the possibility of sanctions against Putin, including oil sanctions. And that's very different than the Trump that we saw in the early days of Trump 47, right? Trump 47, after the Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, the fear was that Trump and Putin were going to just carve up Central Europe and hive off half or maybe more of Ukraine and throw it to Russia because Putin and Trump wanted to do a deal. That's not the case now. Trump is threatening. We'll see if if he actually follows through or if it's taco. Trump always chickens out. We don't know yet, but he's threatening sanctions to Russia. And the Indians are really angry about that, on top of the trade issues that the tariffs that Trump is threatening against India, Supreme Court willing. He's now also threatening more oil sanctions against Russia, and the Indians are freaking out.
But the Indians have the ones that have been immediately hurt. Russia, it's still a threat. And so, again, the logic of that, I'm not sure is clear.
Yeah, particularly because if the New York Times is to be trusted on this, it was a phone call in June between Trump and Modi over Trump's role in settling
India,
Pakistan, and you had two giant egos that, hitting each other. That, according to the Times, that was the start of the downward spiral.
Well, and to something somebody said here before, the problem with great power and great leader politics is if you don't agree with them, you don't get a deal.
Right.
Steve, you were going to jump in and say something else. Well, then I want to push on you for a second with how Europe has responded to all of this. Have they learned to play the game? Has the alliance actually, not just because through Belarus Putin is now attacking a NATO ally, but have they figured Trump out?
I think they have, to a much greater extent than certainly in the first Trump administration. I think they're, to Jeff's point, they have cohered to coordinate their pressure on Trump to try and make him pay attention. Whether he does is another question. But I think the NATO summit earlier this year that resulted in an agreement to boost defense spending to 3.5 or 5% of GDP was a victory for us, and also a victory for those forces in Europe who are arguing for a stronger European defense capability. I think their organization of their rapid trip to Washington in the aftermath of the Alaska summit was also spoken very well, and it was hard to watch. They clearly understand that flattery is the key to persuade Trump to...
Works here at the Miller Center too, just saying.
Under your inspired leadership.
But they also need to work out who had which roles around the table, who was going to be more the flatterer, who was going to be less. I mean, it was Europe working together in a way that, frankly, is unusual to see.
But whether or not, to Jeff's point, that Putin's continuing pressure on the West unites the Europe or with the U.S. more, I think that's an open question. Putin is, or Trump has repeatedly said, I'll just walk away from all of this. And I think there's a really substantial risk of that. It'll be embarrassing for him that he didn't solve Ukraine in 24 hours as he promised. And I think the chances that he's going to wash his hands of it and walk away are great.
And what does walking away mean? On the one hand, he hasn't done a deal with Putin that carves up Ukraine. On the other hand, is it a slow bleed? We stop providing assistance? Could it be what the Europeans seem to be putting on the table is, we'll buy your stuff, we'll pay for it, and we'll give it to the Ukrainians?
So, I think the Trump folks would probably say that they figured Europe out, right? And that's an important component of this, because there are these competing priorities for the Trump administration. One is the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, anywhere you want, right? That's probably not a realistic priority. The other was to get the Europeans to pay their own way, right? And by sort of slowly shifting this onto the European lap, I think that there's a story here that they would certainly sell, which is, we're talking 3.5 to 5% before. Rewind the clock a few years and we were talking 1.5 to 2%, right? So, let's all remember what's going on here. And so that component, I think, of slowly shifting over this whole problem set to the Europeans was the goal here. Now, the flip side of that is it does mean that there's no deal to carve up. It's not ours to carve up anymore because we don't hold the Trump card, right? No, I didn't mean to use that. That was accidental. That was not intentional. But by handing that over to the Europeans, they become fundamentally self-sufficient, and it becomes an extraordinarily aggressive move to say, for example, well, we won't even let you buy our stuff, right? And probably a little bit over the line of what even domestically would be possible to sell to the Republican coalition. And so there is this, I think, sort of interesting, again, dynamic emerging here where the overall doctrine has to prioritize between these competing tendencies for extraordinary levels of unilateralism and this notion of handing over capability to others, which then, of course, gives them autonomy as well.
There's a short-term versus long-term
Precisely.
issue here, right?
Yeah,
So let's see, Dutch F-35s that came from guess where, German Patriot anti-air system came from guess where, from us. The Europeans know in the short term they're heavily dependent, but it seems like in the long term, I think they're quite serious about. I would be if I were the president of France. I would want to break away slowly from the Americans, and I think they're quite serious about that.
Well, it's a historic shift from lend-lease of Roosevelt to sell-collect of Trump.
Yeah.
Right. So it's right. You're offering the weapons, but you're doing a business deal, right? And that's how you're supporting Europe. Yeah, we'll support you if you buy our weapons, basically. So.
Yep, Lend-Lease came about because we were under threat, and we couldn't get and Roosevelt couldn't get the country to agree to go to war, and so it was a making sure that while he got our country together, right, that England and others didn't go under in the meantime. So again, it's a pretty firm view of what the U.S. national security interest is, and transactional to do deals where you always want a bigger piece of the pie than everyone else. Hard to see how that ends up playing out in your country's national interest.
I wonder if at this point we could shift to China. Probably one thing I'm reminded of is Mara and I were in Europe this summer speaking with both other Americans and European defense and security experts. And there was a sense that while Europe was really, really concerned about the current moment, even 4 months ago, they could see their way through to working some new relationship with the United States. But with respect to China, they didn't really have a strategy or a clue almost. And I'm just curious whether that actually also applies to the United States. Trump came in with a view to prioritize China. He came in with a strategy for China. 9 months later, it doesn't appear like there's any strategy. There's a sort of freeze on tariffs that they keep kicking down the road on when we're actually going to come back to a real negotiation. The Chinese don't seem particularly interested in talking to us in a substantive way. And meanwhile, China's going off and they're bringing every other rogue or not so rogue state that we'll visit, like India, and making it look like they've actually improved over the last 9 months and we haven't. Is that a wrong characterization, or is there just a strategy and we're really not smart enough to see
Can I
it?
just ask you a question? When you said he came in with a strategy on China, what would you say that was?
Strategy was, I'm going to make them the number one target on tariffs and they're going to buckle. And to what Jeff said on security, I'm going to do a deal with Putin that's going to be a wedge to China. And if you talk to senior defense officials who used to be academics, they have been arguing this for some time, that this was the thing to do. The fight with Ukraine is not our fight. It's spending resources that we don't have. The real game is China. Let's solve that front by negotiation and take it to the Chinese.
And that's gone.
Yeah, I would say another piece of that has to do with technology, which was we're going to squeeze them on technology, and we're going to try to supplant them or get ahead of them as being the technology provider, platform provider around the world. So the Middle East trip was kind of about that, and other efforts. And of course, we've wavered back and forth on chips. Yeah, we're not giving the chips. Yeah, it's okay to give them the chips.
And we have no real plan on minerals, which the rest of it doesn't work.
Well,
versus what China has.
The cows left the
scoped
barn
out.
on that, right? Because the plan would be stockpile the minerals, and I mean, there are alternative
There's
ways.
a lot of
to
different
look at it.
options.
Things you can do.
Right.
And if the horse is out of the barn on that, then we're totally screwed on both economic security and national security. So I wouldn't be willing to accept that proposition.
So let me try to paint a picture here on what I think this doctrine might be, okay? And bearing in mind what Jeff said, that these things are usually things we figure out after the fact, and for this learned crowd, everyone knows that containment was executed mostly while Kennan was in exile at Princeton, complaining that no one listened to him. So these things are not straightforward in the moment. But I might offer that this is actually looking for 8-9 months in relatively straightforward. And so what I think we have this tendency as foreign policy specialists to look at this from the outside in. So what are we doing with Russia? What are we doing with China? Sort of the dance down on our axis of evil or whatever it might be, right? I think that the key thing that I see that's just fundamentally different in the way people are talking in the Pentagon and the way people are talking in the intelligence community, and it's mostly rhetorical right now, but not entirely, is this Homeland first priority thing, right? Where it's like, well, the SecDef's #1 priority is Homeland, right? But we're starting to see fundamental changes in what's going on in Northcom, Southcom, the Greenland, Panama, you brought these things up. This is not a totally retrenchment story. It's somewhat more expansion. It's our sphere of influence,
From
right?
the North Pole to the Gulf of America.
Precisely, and good deal south of that.
Taking out
right.
a drug trafficker, but
Perhaps
with
to the
no
tip of Chile.
legal
right.
basis for doing it.
Precisely, right. And so, all of the specifics that not sorted, all right, so at best, and some contradictory. But I think that there is this tension we often throw out there between the restrainers, who we think of as that sort of North America story, and the contestation being like, it's not particularly restrained. I don't think it is, because it's not a restrainer, it's a sphere of influence kind of story. Mm-hmm. And these prioritizers who are talking about the China thing, and that's kind of where we are now. And I think both are true, right? As we establish our sphere of influence, we contest their sphere of influence, and the strategy right now looks like radical levels of decoupling from China, which I think is proceeding at a pace that is a little bit head spinning. It's very hard to get to a point of completeness on it, but when you look at sort of where we are now versus where we were a series of months ago, there is noticeable change on what was a durable relationship. And so I think that that's sort of the doctrine and the vision to sort of build our sphere up and make theirs as difficult and complicated and us in there as possible. And we often make the mistake when we talk spheres of influence to think that that implies that we would leave theirs alone, right? Because that's the old way of thinking about it. I think it sort of combines with this more mercantilist, more interference kind of based story about not really leaving theirs alone. So I'll put that out there. I realize that when we get to the specifics, there are a whole bunch of reasons why we might not think that's going to work, but I think that that's maybe what we're looking at here.
As an emergent
As an emergent strategy.
Because so my reading on President Trump is he's an internationalist in the unilateralist sense. Anything goes, the whole planet is,
If it's
fair
my
game.
idea.
Yeah, but he has people, very important people in the administration and Pentagon and state and National Security Council with different ideas, right? So I'm open to what you just said. It just sounds like that this is no one person came in with this master plan or unmasterly plan. But it seems to be, it might be emerging.
I
we
would
will see.
argue we've never had a master plan that was anything but emergent.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Yeah,
true.
fair enough.
And that's the nature of the emergence seems to be happening rather quickly. And I see this sort of thing that keeps happening where it looks like we've got total tariff chaos, for example, right? And suddenly with sort of this head-snapping speed, we've moved to 15% for our friends, 25% for everybody else, and just like random stuff for people who annoy us, right? But that's sort of that's way more coherent than it was, and so it's sort of this gelling factor, I think, is interesting.
But let me just give you immediate examples of why that doesn't work.
Okay.
So Brazil, okay?
People who annoy us.
And people who annoy us, but people who also have a huge number of minerals that we desperately need that China has now locked up. And what we should be looking at, if what we're concerned about is both our spheres of influence and the ability to compete around the world, is what we do with Brazil to get more of the stuff that they have, versus further severing ourselves from them. Look at the relationships with Mexico and Canada, where the largest proportion of trade with the United States and others happens, and yet we're making enemies of them instead of friends. That's within our spheres of influence, and China has already fully permeated Latin America on minerals. Yeah. And so if you don't have country by country ways of getting back, and so what I worry about is both, if that's a thought bubble in someone's head, great. I don't think there's any plan for how you execute it, and I don't think there's any process in place to be able to get to someone having a strategic idea and then figuring out what the routes are, what the alternatives are, and you have no one who's willing to deliver hard truths to the president on what's possible or not, which is a key part of a workable process.
So the thing I would say, if that's the articulated doctrine, what's new in that, right? The new part, which is basically Homeland whatever, America's region security plus China, right? An emphasis on China. The emphasis on China, administrations have been trying to do for whatever, since 2008 at least. And there's been tried to be that renewed emphasis. So the real thing is the homeland piece. And the question is then how does this show up in resources, right? Because in a certain sense, it's where you're going to spend your money and where you're going to position your forces. And I think what that means is, I think some of the budgetary details that have been discussed are more money going to Pacific Com versus, right, and no more money going to European Command, right?
And
So that's a big difference, right? Yeah.
Northcom, Southcom, and PACOM are getting the money.
Right, and the real money, it seems to me, the real increase, and there are increases in the defense budget, right? Significant 13%. We're now at $1 trillion.
There's a one-time. It's
Yeah, it's
not a
one-time. It is
sustained
true. It
plan,
isn't
which is part of what the Wall Street Journal editorial attacked.
Right, but a big piece of that is missile defense. It's the Golden Dome. That's the big black hole of money that would dramatically change, and there is conflict here with your ability to compete with China in Asia and other parts of the world.
And so that combined with sort of economic decoupling and vast deprioritization of Europe puts you in a position to really get into it with China in ways that we were much more constrained, and we self-constrained, intentionally constrained, right? We thought we were building a global order where we wouldn't necessarily want to do that, but this sort of mercantilist deconstruction positions a type of prioritization of China that just wasn't on the table before.
So,
So it seems an essential part of this doctrine, for the doctrine to work that you described, Phil, is absolutely critical is maintaining strong alliance relationships with Japan, South Korea, Philippines, all of our treaty allies. And the signals coming out of the Trump administration have really cast a lot of doubt, put a lot of pressure on the Japan government fell because of our overly pushy efforts on tariffs, the arrest of 475 Korean workers at a Hyundai plant. It's just...
So to be very clear, I'm not saying anything about whether this is going to work or whether it's being executed well. I'm merely trying to articulate what the overarching doctrine could be, right? And so I concede essentially everything that you're saying about, hey, these are some wrinkles that matter a great deal. But the thing about doctrines is I think they only make sense when you sort of get way up above them and squint quite a bit. And they can be executed well or poorly. And some of them, I think, there have been nations that have put out doctrines that are not tenable, right? It doesn't, just because it exists doesn't mean that it can work.
Phil, from that perspective, if you were a senior Trump official, what would you say is the best case scenario in the next 3 years? What does a Trump win look like with China over 3 years that we can call a win and they can live with? Or does it just get worse and worse?
I think it looks something like continued Chinese economic and political turmoil that constrains them, right? That they have enough trouble adapting to this new reality that they are stuck in a perennial cycle of not today with regard to sort of the acute issues, Taiwan, for example, right? And they are not able to continue to push. And so they are stuck in their sort of Pacific bathtub while we continue to be in that space. In the meantime, we have, Intel is now a world-dominating company. There are going to be some issues there. And we've, managed to sort of shore up a lot of our homeland and made a lot of investments and those sorts of things. And the Europeans are doing their own thing off over in the corner themselves, right? And handling that part of the world. That's, I think, my best articulation of the doctrine that I'm sort of, again, standing back and squinting at, but something along those lines. Others may see it differently.
Yeah, I would add that, I think, I don't know what they would define as a win, but certainly as an outside observer, I think the key challenge actually is who has the high ground in terms of long-term economic development, technology, leadership of the international economy. And I think if you have a clear win would be stalemate kind of militarily, strategically, And economically, there is tight coordination and action between the U.S. and its major allies of industrialized countries in terms of cooperating on technology among them and limiting China's ability to be part of those networks unless it changes its policies and actions in terms of economic exchange, technology development, intellectual property rights. That, to me, is the biggest threat to China in the long term, and that's why the alliance structure is so fundamental.
I think fleshing that out a little bit, staying ahead of China in AI matters a lot, at least to portions of the administration. And in fact, when I think about if we have to be in an AI race, I would rather win it. I wish we were in a different world where we weren't in such a race. But I think that, and I would add, if China does not move on Taiwan, that's also a little win.
And as a reminder, 2027 was the date by
Right.
which the Chinese said they would be prepared and capable of forcibly taking Taiwan if things went bad, or it's a qualified,
Right.
but a quite clear statement of intent, which would happen on the Trump watch.
That's right. That's right. And so regarding AI, I want to make the case. It's hard to kind of figure out Trump's recent moves on China, but my colleague and I know about the NVIDIA decision. NVIDIA has been making the case for a while to Washington that they ought to be allowed to sell to China because that will keep China dependent and it will disincentivize China to some extent from actually developing their own world-class chips. We will see. We are now running an experiment
China
with
agrees
this.
because they said we're not going to allow the companies to buy NVIDIA's chips.
Right. Yeah.
So-
Right. So we'll see how this plays out.
Right.
Yeah.
But before pivoting off, a couple questions have come in from the audience about the idea of a homeland approach, particularly the Trump administration's attack against the Venezuelan crime cartel, purportedly. Talk a little bit about that. That was quite a bold move. It was one of 2 or 3 aggressive, offensive military rules that seemed to challenge conventional doctrine. Did it accomplish anything? Do we have a sense that it was driven and justified by a real concern, or was it just a unique, targeted show of force for theater purposes, or is it all of the above?
I read it primarily as the latter, right? It's an unnecessary amount of force for the target set, pretty obviously. That doesn't mean that it's not a useful form of communication and deterrence, but I think that to me, it's a very clear demonstration of this idea that this is our world, right? This is our hemisphere. We're going to do what we want to do in it. I'm awfully cautious about. I really wish the Venezuelans would stop flying F-16s over these ships, because I think that there's a good chance that becomes an excellent way to do the same thing again, right? And so there is, I think, to me, this is sort of the bleeding edge of this change in mindset. Mm-hmm. And I think the things that are going to get picked for demonstration purposes, quite reasonably, are places where there's no real opportunity for anyone to do anything about it, right? And so, targeting that boat, for example, people can say, I think that might be against international law and all sorts of things, and
US
they can
law,
thumb their nose.
against US law,
precisely,
and we'll discuss
precisely.
that.
But
That's the
if they're
difference.
in a position to thumb their nose at that, which they appear to be at this point in time, it actually is a pretty clean pivot, right? And so I think we need to really have our eye on those sorts of moments that we assumed were off the table, that I think are kind of on the table right now, and they can be profoundly transformative in terms of the way we're relating to other countries, the way we're perceived international. All of these things are things that are intentionally being tweaked, right?
It reminds me of one other thing, and it goes to what Mara said about the renaming of the Department of Defense, the Department of War. In the exact days that they did that and rolled that out, the biggest use of military force was domestically, including rhetorically. And I'm just curious to get the take around the table, not just at the legal status of that, which is obviously being contested and challenged, but what that says to our armed forces. How do we think they're feeling about the current moment where they've both had a name change operation and maybe a mission change operation?
So the rule of law is actually intrinsic to our national security. The respect for the rule of law undergirds the basis of how the United States operates at home and around the world. So it is not a small thing to me that this kind of action was taken, and that by all reports was taken either without or ignoring the council of lawyers inside the Pentagon. They've already decimated the JAG Corps. The Secretary of Defense, when he was testifying in his nomination hearing, in his confirmation hearing, got into it with Jack Reed, the ranking Democrat, on precisely this issue, on how he valued or didn't value legal guidance and advice in the Pentagon. So I think this is an incredibly dangerous moment. And I think it's also very interesting and telling. So I spent a lot of time on war powers notifications, both when I was on the Hill as chief counsel and then in the executive branch. They did the war powers notification to Congress. They keep postponing briefing, which is pretty extraordinary at this point.
What could be going on? Yeah.
So to be clear, I don't think this is a small thing at all. I think that's why the destruction of a relatively small vessel is fundamental to this change in doctrine, right? That it is actually a profoundly consequential choice because it pivots everything, inclusive of the way our domestic politics are run, that enable just a totally different mindset in terms of what we're doing. And so I concede the point, but I think that both can be true simultaneously.
I think at some point that the usurping of congressional powers, which you also see through the impoundment, and just how the Supreme Court thus far has been in various kind of wait and see. I'm not part of the camp that thinks the court's going to just allow the president to do whatever he wants. But the checks and balances in our system are being maximally challenged, and I think, to me, that's what we'll see play out over the next 2 or 3 years, which will determine how much, I think it will determine how much we continue to have a democracy.
And how much do people, and Steve, maybe I'll turn to you because though you were State Department, I'm sure State Department officials have this, you spend a lot of time talking to military people in those State Department positions. How do you suspect, or how do you know they're viewing folks in the deep state or in the administrative state or career civil servants?
Well, these days they're seeing them as largely reduced and gone. Those who, obviously the State Department laid off 1,400 people, which is the biggest layoff in the State Department's history. And those that remain, based on my contacts inside, are basically afraid to speak up. They're constantly looking over their shoulder before they will suggest things. So maybe that will work out fine, but history tends to prove that unless you have a full debate of policy options and teeing up issues for the president to decide, sooner or later there are going to be mistakes made, and I think there's a great fear that that's inevitable.
We've got about 10 minutes before we go completely to audience Q&A. I want to turn to the Middle East. Last night, just as there was military activity in Central Europe, there was also military activity in Israel and Qatar. Israel attacked Hamas leadership in Qatar. In the first Trump administration, the Abraham Accords were perhaps one of their biggest accomplishments. Qatar has been a non-NATO ally of the United States. We've worked with them, particularly in the current conflict in the Middle East, as the place where the negotiations between Israel and Hamas are taking place for one thing or another. And the Trump administration actually spoke out against the attack yesterday. So
And we have significant military resources.
And we have, thank you, significant military resources.
Yeah,
Though not without complications. Qatar is still certainly not a democracy, and in the Middle East has its own set of complications. I'm just curious where you see the broader set of relationships going there in the Trump administration. They thought they had an approach in the first term. And this seems to be slipping from their hands.
I think the first thing to say for me would be it's a different kind of test on Trump. He threatened, I've got Israel on board now, Hamas, and Netanyahu took that a certain way and decided to push and see. He had strategic, tactical reasons to do what he did in attacking Qatar, but also wants to take advantage
I'd
of.
love to hear what his strategic tactical reasons were in your mind.
Just wipe out more Hamas leaders. That's all. I think, kill as many of those guys as you can. And also thinking Trump will let me get away with this because, he doesn't actually follow through, at least with me. So I think, again, if, getting back to what I said earlier, the Trump, insofar as a strategy regarding, the world, it's I'm going to be the great negotiator, deal broker, peacemaker, maybe a Nobel Peace Prize in the future. And it involves distancing myself from everybody. That just hasn't happened here either, right? The United States is more firmly with Israel than before, and Israel is, the Israeli leadership, I think, is taking advantage of that. I think that's what happened last night. That's my initial take.
We've spent a lot of time in the region talking to a lot
Yeah,
of
so
people.
now you hear from an expert.
Yeah, no, I think it will be shown to be a pretty fundamental miscalculation by Israel. I think even just like in the face to President Trump to do it when literally he had put out the proposal, he said Israel's with us, he wanted Hamas to be considering it. They were meeting to consider it.
Yep.
And so the timing could not have been worse. Now, Netanyahu says it was because there was a horrendous attack in Jerusalem that morning, and that was why he went forward in the afternoon, showing absolutely no strategic patience.
Sure.
I would say the opposite of it.
I mean, my point was more about Trump, that he's unable to restrain, that in other words, he's being tested. And
He's being tested. So, But what I was going to say is that I was struck by how strong the statement was that the White House put out last night. They couldn't have been more clear, both that they were unhappy with this action, which Trump then reiterated when he had a brief press gaggle, I think, going somewhere last night. He said he's putting out a longer statement today. As far as I know, it hasn't come out yet.
Another delayed.
But
press
they
conference.
they came out very strongly, and they were also very clear, though it was initially confusing the timeline, that first of all, the White House learned about it from the U.S. military, which also means they did not get a heads up. It was as it was happening. And the Qataris were very clear in saying they got a call from the White House, but after it had already started. But that's because the Israelis were very deliberate in what they did. Now, sometimes they tell us in advance, and sometimes they don't. I think there's a wide misperception in the world that the United States has the ability to call Israeli leadership on the phone and just say, don't do this, and they don't do it. That itself is a complete misperception. But the back and forth on this one, I think it will be interesting to see. Trump really cares about the relationships in the Gulf, and for good reason, whether they're democracies or not.
Right.
Because they give him nice airplanes. That's right.
I wasn't going to take the easy shot on that, just because I actually think there are a lot of reasons, right?
Yeah.
Sure,
And
a lot
to
of
me,
reasons,
one of
a
the
lot of
things
reasons.
that's fascinating is most of the Gulf countries don't get along with each other. You know, the dirty secret, they can't stand each other. The fact that within like less than 24 hours, the Emiratis, who were the champions of the Abraham Accords, came out and I believe called it a criminal act. Saudi Arabia came out with a statement, and I think that both the Emirati leader and the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia are traveling to Qatar in solidarity, which is phenomenal because what those countries generally do is badmouth one another constantly. And so the fact that they are showing up together against Israel sets back like 10 years of progress that Israel had made in the region, and that what's in the United States' interest, which is a security and economic regional framework that would allow us to be less present because they together can do stuff and would allow us to put more resources into places like the Asia Pacific, is if not gone, set back considerably. Never mind the hostages in Gaza, Israeli hostages who were already in a terrible position and are, without question, in a worse position now, and Palestinians who are just trying to hang on there.
I would say just total own goal, especially in the sense that even from an Israeli standpoint, as far as I can read their actions, they're about to do some things that are going to be intensely controversial in Gaza, right? And this helps nothing with regard to that. And so I think I've spent enough time in this conversation trying to squint and make sense of things. This one just doesn't make a ton of sense unless you look at it from an Israeli domestic politics standpoint, and that they just are not, they're running out of runway in terms of things.
It doesn't work
that
there.
They,
I mean, what this
then I give up.
does
Like,
is
luckily, I get to be the person who's like, none of it makes sense.
this is the Hamas strategy,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is played out. This is Yahya Sinwar's
So what do you
dream
think? What do you
of his
think did
approach.
happen? Why did they do it then? Just like,
So, I mean, I would say this is a perfect manifestation, and the same with the strike on the Venezuela ship, that the Trump foreign policy is being driven by domestic political priorities, that drug interdiction, border security is key to his base and beyond, the intermediates that are supporting the base. And Israel is too. And Netanyahu knows Trump has nowhere to go on Israel. And so he has a certain limited window here to take the actions that he knows are incredibly controversial, that he's going to be hated for in the world, but thinks they're in Israeli interest and maybe his own domestic political interest, which is smash Hamas totally, right? And maybe the strike on Hamas, I don't know this, maybe there was progress in negotiations that was going to get in the way of what he wanted to do in Gaza, right? So, hey, we'll disrupt that. Where's Trump going to go, right? Even in that statement that was very angry, let the hostages go. Hamas, let the hostages go now. Like it's Hamas's fault now for this, right? So he doesn't have anywhere to go. That gives a free hand to Israel. That's the only sense I can make of it.
The only place I disagree with you is actually Netanyahu's domestic politics. It's his own immediate interest. It's not where the majority of the Israeli people
Right,
are.
no,
The majority of the
Right.
Israeli people are firmly in doing everything you can to get hostages out, and believe what the Israeli military has said quite publicly, which is that they have mitigated the threat to Hamas, and that destroying Hamas completely is very likely an unattainable goal and at great cost to Israel itself. And I think that's where the majority of the Israeli public are. That's not where the coalition that's keeping him in
Right.
power is.
Right.
I want to turn to, since we're coming at the top of the hour with about a little more than 15 minutes left, I'll turn to audience questions. Partly very grateful for this question because it was on my list already, and now I can count it as an audience question, which is how much of the administration policies or positions of Trump's and how much are actually from his advisors. We've gone from the team of rivals to the team of
Sycophants?
I'll let you say it, and not me, sycophants. But then again, we've seen some really interesting moves in the cabinet already. Secretary Rubio is also the national security advisor. He had 2 or 3 other jobs. I think he started giving some of those away. Pete Hegseth has been, let's just say, slightly controversial in his time at defense. Very interesting back and forth, ups and downs around Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence. Ups. And then after some downs, and then ups, and who knows. And then the economic team has played a significant, if not one voice role in foreign policy. So give us your sense of this team. Who are they? How do they relate to one another? Are they driving policy or following policy? Oh, and I meant to say there's a special negotiator who seems every day to be in a different part of the world. How is this working or not?
And was also at the U.S. Open, though.
Oh, was he really? Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
How is this working or not working? Steve, you've done a lot of process.
Well, there's not any serious process to speak of. Certainly, the cabinet is very loyal to the boss. They prove that at every cabinet meeting. But there's only so much without a central coordination, policy coordination that used to be organized by the NSC, which had gotten to be way too big, no doubt about that. But now it's the total opposite. And so the president, by the virtue of the whole complexity of the world, is only able to concentrate on so many things at a time. And so repeatedly we see parts of the administration moving off in different directions from each other until it becomes a controversy and then attracts the president's attention. The situation earlier this summer where Elbridge Colby, the number 3 at the Defense Department, basically stopped the supply of air defense missiles to Ukraine, even as Trump was talking up the need to reinforce Ukraine. The Pentagon's cutback of Baltic Security Initiative funds, Section 333 funds, which are really vitally important to strengthening the Baltic states' defense capabilities. And that was signaled that that's coming to an end. And at the same time, President Trump was hosting the Polish President Nawrocki in the Oval Office saying, no, we're going to increase the U.S. troop presence in Poland. So it creates a massive confusion that there isn't one central coordination point for these important policies.
You managed a lot of process.
Yeah, and I would say that good process doesn't guarantee good policy.
Right.
But bad process almost always means you're not going to get the outcomes that you sought. And you haven't, because you have no way of dealing with unanticipated consequences. You have no way of getting the best recommendations to the president. You know, and I will say, I like you, Steve, have long been someone that thought that the National Security Council staff had mushroomed way out of control. And in the Clinton administration, I will say, much to the National Security Advisor's frustration, he said, why is this the one campaign promise Bill Clinton has kept is keeping the size of the NSC at the same size that H.W. Bush did. And then under the next Bush and then under Obama, and just kept mushrooming. So literally from like 125 staff to 400. And part of my argument for it being small is that you need the agility at the NSC. You need to be able to coordinate and have the agencies, which are huge, do their jobs. And at the end of the day, you have one national security advisor, you have one president. And so you don't want a huge body of people generating a lot of stuff and activities. So now we have no people, or very few, not able to send up, not able to trust what they can write or have any kind of sense of protection. And I think really there's just no process. And you still only have one president and half a national security advisor, because Rubio has at least 3 jobs still. And so that is the single thing that probably, like people ask what keeps you up at night. It seems weird to say it's process, but it's the fact that there is none.
Yeah, I'll go up to 10,000 feet and just make one observation. It's not the case. So this is an overwhelmingly loyal cabinet. That's clear. That doesn't mean that the cabinet members don't have their own preferences and even strategies and visions for a better world or a more powerful America. It's just that I think when the boss says do, they do, and they jump how high and so on. But short of that, they're like in the first Trump administration, my sense is trying to move the boss over here or look over here. They're just doing it differently, maybe a little more skillfully, but they do disagree with each other. And so I think it's good to keep that in mind, that there are people trying to pull policy this way or that way. So, for example, hemispheric, Phil mentioned, we need to concentrate on the Western Hemisphere and border security and Iron Dome and so on. No, we need to look at China is the big problem. Coming out of that might be, well, those are the two. But Europe, sorry Africa, you're out of luck. But this comes out of a process of people. Extremely loyal cabinet members, but with their own preferences trying to move things. That's my reading.
So, but that's every White House, right? That's every cabinet. People are always maneuvering for position and maneuvering for time in the Oval, right? But if you have no, and I don't think you can call that a process. That's like the part of, you get very ambitious people who are in these positions who are sure they have the answer, and they're always trying to manage the executive, right? But you have no way of corralling that to the benefit of the executive.
No, that's right. I just was making the point that we shouldn't go from ultimate, complete loyalty to whatever he says is fine with me. I have no preferences of my own. It's a more normal administration, on my reading, in that sense, notwithstanding the way these cabinet meetings look.
Because they're doing it over signal chats instead.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, that's where you see some of that internal maneuvering.
So I don't know if this is reassuring or not, but it's more. I just see it's a little more normal in that sense. Of course,
Doesn't it seem, and I'm going to steer it back to Steve here, that Rubio is the whisperer? And I'm using both Ukraine and the Homeland stuff. He's somebody that knows the hemisphere extremely well. And somehow he managed a NATO summit that ends up being relatively successful and looks like a win from the Trump perspective. And just like on economic affairs, Bessent is the whisperer. He's kind of sidelined other people, got them to obey a little bit, threatening to punch people in the nose.
Big guys.
It's not an A-plus process, but it's he has deputies that are managing things. Or is that not right?
Well, I mean, he's certainly a good listener. I don't know if he's the whisperer, but he's very skilled at translating the president's desires into deliverable on the foreign policy front. And so that strictly by that standard alone, he's successful in achieving what Trump's vision is. He doesn't really, though, have a full team. There's not even a nominee for Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. There's not even a nominee for Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America. There are other significant gaps in the State Department leadership, and so that constrains his ability to get anything done.
People at State are not happy about the current situation.
No.
Let me ask Steve, stick with you for 1 second about something else the Trump folks may point to as a win, which was the attack on Iran's nuclear holdings. They did this relatively quickly after Israel had a short war with Iran. What do you know about the process, and what can we say after the fact about whether or not it was successful?
Well, I think it's too early.
And as a reminder for folks that don't either know or remember but Steve worked on Iran issues at the State Department at the end of the Obama administration on implementing the Iran nuclear agreement. And then after a brief time out of the State Department on a sort of research leave of that kind, came back in as Undersecretary for Policy. So you have a sense of how the Trump people think about Iran, which was different how the Obama people do.
No,
and then they went very far in this case.
Very, very much so. And again, it was a mixed message. Trump was regularly touting the success of his diplomatic outreach to Iran. Witkoff had a number of meetings with Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, and each time they seemed to be getting closer to an agreement. And then all of a sudden, Israel attacked, and Trump was initially skeptical of it, publicly skeptical of it, but then got swept up in the emotion of the moment. The next thing you know, we're delivering bunker buster bombs at Isfahan and Fordo. And so I think it's too early to say, it certainly was daring, I'll give him that, but it's too early to say if it was successful. We still don't know where 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium are. Was it destroyed? Was it squirreled out somewhere else? And we still don't really have insight into whether or not it was successful. And then adding to that, there's now very little trust in Iran. I thought there was a lot of trust in Iran towards the United States before. There's even less now. Nevertheless, the senior Iranian leadership is in the thick of a debate. All right, do we concede on enrichment and make nice with the United States, or do we exit the Non-Proliferation Treaty and get into a full race for a nuclear weapon? And that's very, very much up in the air. With good arguments on both sides, and so we'll see. The Europeans about 10 days ago launched a snapback procedure in the UN Security Council under the terms of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. To that, it will give 30 days that unless they withdraw that, the UN sanctions that were lifted by the JCPOA will automatically snap back into place. And they've indicated to the Iranians that they will be willing to delay that if Iran opens up its nuclear program to IAEA inspection, if Iran once again sits down with the United States, which Secretary Rubio has continued to say that we are ready to do so, and to account for the highly enriched uranium. So if the 30 days elapses and the sanctions are snapped back without any effective answer from Iran, I fear that the next step is Iran's withdrawal from the NPT and accelerating its efforts for a nuclear weapon.
And what do we know about cabinet politics around Iran? Like, did Trump dream this up himself, or was there somebody advocating for this? We saw in the first Trump administration, they went after General Soleimani. There were a lot of Iran hawks. Interestingly enough, they didn't; the principal ones didn't come back into this administration. What's it like inside on the issue of Iran? It's a super important place.
Right. I don't know, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
No inside information.
Stump the panel. One last question here with 3 minutes to go. Where is it? Here we go. Can you comment on the budget situation, possible government shutdown, and how it affects these issues? How are we thinking about, and how should the country be thinking about a budget fight? We've come through a new budget. As we saw, there was some increased defense spending. It may not be permanent. Where does the ongoing Trump White House, including Russ Vought and Stephen Miller, emphasis to keep chipping away at the size of parts of the federal government, even though the deficit will grow because of the extension of tax cuts, chipping away at size of the government will affect national security broadly. Steve touched already on the elimination of foreign aid, but that's just a tiny fraction of a big national security budget. Where do we see this going?
The reason I gave you the side eye on the defense budget is because it is precisely the kind of problem, and the National Defense Strategy Commission laid this out, like a one-time infusion is not what is needed. What is needed is a significant increase in our defense spending over time that can be planned against, that can get to the kind of innovation in the industrial base that we need, that shows, because as you pointed out earlier, the combination of national and economic security, those issues are intertwined. I don't think it's just this administration. I think it's where the world is going and how the United States needs to think of. We have big challenges to solve, and they similarly apply for both our economic and our national security. Government shutdowns and doing supplementals and doing continuing resolutions directly slices against what is in our security interest, both our economic security interest and our national security interest. And so you basically negate the impact of the one-time infusion in defense spending with the shutdown and or with a short-term continuing resolution. And this is part of the problem of the dysfunction of Congress right now. I mean, it's long been a problem. It's just exacerbated.
Which predates Trump.
Right, no, absolutely. But then you have an OMB director, Russell Vought, who is very canny and clearly has a strategy of a unitary executive that, I read Article 1 of the Constitution, and I was reminded of it frequently, and Congress is the one that appropriates. I had very uncomfortable conversations when I was in the executive branch to have to remind the people I worked for that the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue wrote the checks. And so they were going to have to actually ask them for the money and make the case to them. And so we've got an executive branch that's trying not to do that. I think it will be fully tested in what seems like, at this point, a fairly likely government shutdown. But that's why I think there's so many different elements that are heading to a collision course that make us less secure as a country.
I'll add two quick, sorry,
Go ahead,
Jeff.
you
I'll be very quick. I worry about the fiscal situation generally. I mean, we're starting to see cracks all over highly indebted countries. Obviously, that is the foundation of security, and therefore anything that does that is a catastrophic break that's hugely problematic. And to Mara's point, the other thing I wonder a little bit about is an enormous number of the behaviors that have emerged over time with regard to how the executive responds to a shutdown are less set in stone than I think we imagine that they are. And so how a more creative executive responds to that situation could look extremely different than how we've seen it in the past. And so I think we just need to be awfully careful about thinking that what is past is prologue here.
Yeah, just again, budget, foreign policy, how do they connect? Obviously, the tariffs are a big piece of that right now because they are bringing in revenue, right? But that revenue, you can't count on that because over the longer run, you're going to need to get rid of those tariffs if you want longer term dynamic economic growth. So to the extent you're starting to base that as a baseline assumption, you're in trouble. And of course, the ultimate thing below this is who has the authority, as Mara was pointing out. And if the Democrats adopt a posture of we're just going to roadblock this, I mean, we are going to get to the separation of powers, and there's going to be a real test of authority that might not be very pleasant.
I wouldn't put it on the Democrats.
What's that?
I think it's Congress taking up responsibility, and so it's not, you can't be the only choices that the minority has. Either
Right.
goes with everything the majority wants or is responsible for closing stuff down. I think it's much more nuanced than that.
Right, but there have been strategies put out there saying Democrats should just say no, regardless. This is the only place there's
What they
authority
do on the
left.
budget shutdown issue.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I just think it's more nuanced. And just a quick point, though, on the budget and tariffs, that's the American people paying,
Correct.
right? That's not foreign countries paying in terms of
Right.
the money that's coming in.
And if the tariffs end at the Supreme Court, the Treasury, as Secretary Bessent said, is going to have to refund quite a bit of money to a lot of companies.
In a very complicated
Way.
way.
This last point that so many of you touched on, I think, is really important. And the good news is the Miller Center will spend a lot of time on this 2 weeks from now. We have no events next week, but 2 weeks from yesterday, we'll start a 2-day conference on the American presidency, where we'll be looking at the role of the Office of Management and Budget, Article 1 versus Article 2, how Congress budgets, and then also how and where presidents declare national security emergencies and domestic emergencies. So we hope you all will join that. The conference happens during the day. It will be live streamed here in this room, slightly bigger table. We'll have about 30 former White House officials, evenly split from both political parties, about 20 of the top scholars on the American presidency, and a handful of journalists who will moderate the conversations. In the evening, there is a public event at the Rotunda on Wednesday night, September 24th. We'll be looking at 2 case studies of presidential leadership. President Bush 43's effort to end AIDS in Africa, also known as PEPFAR. We designed this long before it became a budget fight, but it's also become a budget fight. And then also President Obama's successful raid to bring Osama bin Laden to justice. We'll have senior officials from both of those White Houses talking about how the presidents led and how their teams worked together, including in both cases with Congress on those events. So we hope you will join us for that. And finally, thank you to our panelists today. A really terrific discussion. I'm lucky that I get to do this every 2 weeks with these folks and that we get to bring it to you a few times a semester. And thanks to all of you for joining us, both here in the room and online, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.